Over the Hills and Far Away by Rahman. Prologue. In the wake of the deadly 18th century, there is peace and prosperity between England and Spain at last. However, peace came with its price. While the monarchs and aristocrats of the realms remained unaffected, the English navy discarded 3/4 of its loyal sailors, leaving them to unemployment and poverty. Thus began a golden age, a decade of piracy, only inflamed further by a German prince, George I, taking the English throne in 1714. Many forsook their homes to venture out into the New World, the recently discovered Americas and the Caribbean islands, in search of fortune and adventure. With loyalty to no one and a burning anger against the oppression of the British military, pirates roamed the Caribbean. A single plunder gained a pirate more than the amount of money a regular sailor would be paid over 20 years. And, as savage as they might have been, pirate captains were chosen democratically. All men were given a chance at glory. 1/4 of most pirate crews were made up of former slaves. And if a limb was lost at battle, a pirate was generously compensated for his losses. But as they became more noticeable, several measures were taken to rid the sea of pirates. Our apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes, for now he's free to sing and play, over the hills and far away. Over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain, the Queen commands and we'll obey, over the hills and far away. We all shall lead more happy lives, by getting rid of brats and wives, that scold and bawl both night and day, over the hills and far away. Over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain, the Queen commands and we'll obey, over the hills and far away. Courage, boys, 'tis 1 to 10, but we return all gentlemen as well as they, over the hills and far away. Over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal and Spain, the Queen commands and we'll obey, over the hills and far away. The captain panicked as his sails burnt to ashes. The pirates that had been pursuing his ship generously rained cannon fire and mortar onto it. He ran from one end of the ship to the other, barking orders to the deckhands to douse the flames and prepare for battle. He yelped as grapple hooks flew into the sky, floating there for a moment almost timelessly, before they dropped down on deck, the chains that bound the hooks being dragged slowly back, clinking as they searched for purchase. They slithered on the ash-speckled wood like iron snakes and drew taut as they held onto the banister. He could see the pirates pulling the chains, bringing the two ships closer. The captain only had a moment to read the pirate ship's name, the Tinker's Curse, before he turned with eyes widened to offer consolation to the rest of his distressed crew. As the ships came closer, the captain's men armed themselves, drawing their cutlasses and readying their muskets. They were no marines, but they would have to do. Slowly, the noise was relatively blocked out during the limbo of preparation. The captain could feel his insides churning and his bladder become loose. He gulped down a sob and tried to control himself as, "Lay aboard, lads!" cried the pirate captain. "Take everything that isn't nailed down and make a meal for the fish out of these plain sailors." The pirates climbed aboard, determination and desire raging in their eyes as they attacked the ill-experienced crew. Gunfire and the crash of blades, the cries of anguish and the grunts of pain rang in the air. The pirate captain ploughed his way through, his cutlasses slicing the throat of a descending sailor and then fending off the blow from another. The clash of swords was broken as he kicked the second sailor away and slashed the blade down on his skull, making blood spray upwards. The pirate pulled out 2 blunderbusses and shot 2 approaching sailors before dislodging his cutlass. The pirate spied the piteous captain holding a sword and cowering in fear. The pirate stepped towards him. "Stay back!" he cried. "Stay back, you demons!" The pirate did not respond. He continued to advance. "Stay back, please, in mercy's name!" The captain dropped his sword and edged back, stumbling over a keg of rum, trying desperately to crawl away. "Take anything you want, but spare me, please!" The pirate paused, his sword raised. "Do you know anything about Ben Hornigold? Where he is?" who he's looking for. The captain's mouth remained agape, as if he were unable to comprehend the pirate's question. "No, sir, I don't," he replied in a small voice. "Then I've no use for you." The sky bloomed as blood-red as the sunset, appearing to sink into the ocean. The fluffy clouds tainted pink in the mottled heavens. Captain Tom McCarthy sat watching the dolphins in the distance leap out of the ocean and dive back in front of the dying sun. He took a swig of his green bottle of rum before sitting back a little and looking into the flames before him. He was a man in his early 30s, but looked to be trapped within the age of 25, save the creases in his forehead. His beard was scarce, and he seemed to have a countenance of naivety. Tom was not of the greatest stature, and his width was not the most built. It only made him all the more dangerous. He was accustomed to wearing simple, loose clothing, but recent indulgences had him wearing a red coat sewn with brass buttons and white tassels. He'd also recently invested in a wide-brimmed, feathered hat, and he seemed to cherish the item of clothing. The Tinker's Curse lay docked on the coast of an uncharted island after the crew had raided the modest schooner only a few hours ago. It was a nice place that Tom had discovered, with a long stretched beach and a jungle of exotic trees and creatures beyond it. The crew were spread out across the beach, sitting around small fires, eating, drinking and singing old ballads to each other in mirth. It was a nice place to idle, especially after the fall of the Pirate Republic of Nassau. It now belonged once again to the British, as pirates were being hunted up and down the Caribbean. A pardon had been offered by the king to any pirate that wanted to give up his crimes. There were only two decisions if you were caught and captured: accept the pardon and walk penniless but free, or be hung by the neck until dead. The dead and rotting carcasses of pirates hung in gibbets in places like Jamaica and the Bahamas, as a sign and warning for anyone who wanted to attempt a life of piracy. It was a hard time for Tom, with the famous pirates Blackbeard and Calico Jack drinking damnation at the bottom of the sea, and the ex-pirate Benjamin Hornigold betraying the rest of them by turning pirate hunter. But after his little disagreement back home in London, England, and then the twist of fate with the Anglo-Spanish Wars, Tom had little choice but to continue his life as a pirate and earn the fortune he'd promised his family. His pride wouldn't allow him to go back empty-handed and proven wrong. Well, perhaps not so empty-handed, but not enough to be a gentleman. Tom brushed his light brown hair back with his gloved hand, wiping the sweat off his forehead and his neck, taking another long sip of his drink. "Oi, Tinker!" Tom looked up, his tanned face looking darker in the firelight and the dying rays of the sun. "Malcolm," he smiled as the young man approached. "Don't call me that." Malcolm, Tom's quartermaster and close friend, sat opposite him on a wooden box. "I don't see why not," he said, laughing and taking off his black leather coat and rolling up the sleeves of his worn, greying tunic. "Seems to suit you well." Malcolm Smith was Tom's physical opposite. He was a brute of a boy with closely cropped black hair, but had a face that smiled often. "Aye, perhaps," said Tom, passing Malcolm a bottle. "But Captain Tinker doesn't ring right, mate." Malcolm took the bottle. "A fine catch today, eh?" "A schooner, lad. Not someone I'd call fine, but good enough." "Aye, after all of the things that have been working against our favour." The young man reached into his boot and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Here." "What's this?" asked Tom, taking the sheet and unfolding it. "Reply to your yearly letter, Tom. Picked it up for you when we docked in Kingston. Forgot to hand it to ye." Tom didn't reply. He just read the letter with a frown and furrowed brows, trying to absorb the tragedy it detailed. The door shuddered as it was slammed shut, and a young man was thrown onto the floor in his father's rage. The woman, who had been going about her household chores, backed away and tried to dissociate herself from the impending scene. She looked away, her dark red hair covering her view of the younger man and the older one, her husband. "You're a bloody fool," barked the father. "A bloody fool, I sired. You earned a decent keep for Mr. Robertson." The younger man got up on one elbow, moving slowly and spitting to the side. From the corner of her vision, the woman saw blood come away with his saliva. "Decent keep?" said the young man slowly. Aye, a decent keep, but what dignity, father, eh? I might as well be a Negro slave in the Bahamas. Oh, still dreaming of your bleeding fortune, are you, son? His father jeered, bending down to sneer in his son's face. You spit on a wealthy man's shoes, disgrace him and get your arse fired as hell out of the man's house, and yet you still think you have the courage and the discipline to become a what did you call it? His father mockingly said the word. A privateer? It's not just a dream, Papa, the boy snapped, turning over and straightening. England and Spain are fighting their bloody guts out, and we're sitting around shining some gentleman's shoes, working on his godforsaken farm and cleaning out his pissed-on kitchens, when lads out there in the New World are making a keep by fighting for their country. I could. Oh, just listen to your goddamn twaddle. The father slapped the boy hard across his face. You've any idea what's lurking about those waters, eh? You have a bloomin' inkling of an idea? You want to know what'll happen? I'll tell you here and now. You'll end up dead. From what I know of you, going off at night, drinking your bleeding heart to dysfunction, and no blooming discipline whatsoever, you'll wind up drowned at the bottom of the ocean with no stone at your head, no lord in your mind, and no family in your heart. You hear me, Thomas? You'll not win respect or fortune. It's for men of far better quality than you. What, like you mean? The young man stood up. Like you? Who walks about like he don't care and everybody curses him a tinker and marks him down for his poverty? Hold your tongue, Tom. I'll not. Here's a chance to make better of our family, and you'll not take it. I'd a chance to better my family when you were working for Mr. Robertson. Oh, bother speaking with you. Tom stomped his way to the back door. The woman grabbed his arm and said softly, Son, please, your father meant well, he's just upset. Tom turned, narrowing his eyes, and snapped, I am not your son. Tom woke from his dream, eyes open, his body pouring with sweat. He hadn't been startled by it, but it seemed to fill him with a choking sensation, as if taking his every breath took some great effort and great thought. Tom was sure it was well past the time to rise, but lingered in bed, replaying the memory over and over again while staring at the ceiling. And the more he thought on it, the more it hurt. He was about 16 then. Those were the last words he'd said to his father before he left for the New World. And, it seemed, the last words he'd ever say to the old man. His father had passed away that year, a few months previously actually, all of a sudden. The letter had detailed apoplexy, but considering the poor experience of the apothecaries that his family could afford, Tom couldn't be sure. He sighed, knowing this whole event would bother him for years to come. Tom sat up, his cot-like bed in his cabin aboard creaking as he did so, and rubbed the back of his neck and the scarce stubble on his chin. Tom's father's wife and his half-sister were being sent to him. They would arrive in Kingston, awaiting his welcome. My welcome, he thought. What welcome could I offer to a woman who ever sought my acceptance but never received it, and a girl who I've never even met? What would I tell them? How could they live by me? Tom looked out of the small round window placed high up on the wall. When I know that turncoat is combing the ocean in search of me, in some hope that I'll hang or return a pauper. But no matter how much he pondered on these questions, the decision had already been made for him. Tom dressed quickly, taking a moment to admire himself in his looking-glass, straightening his hat a little, before stepping out of his cabin and taking the wheel at the helm of his ship. Where to, Captain? Said Malcolm. We're sailing for Jamaica, he replied briefly as Malcolm barked orders to the other deckhands. I left home for the sake of my family. I'll not abandon them now for my own sake. Tom sat back in his seat, scarcely sipping his flagon of rum as he watched the enchanting dancers sing and spin around the veranda of a tavern. They had no spell on him today. From his seat, Tom could see the Jamaican harbour, and he watched it constantly and almost involuntarily. He was in a mixture of moods. Partially, he was rejoicing. He would finally meet the sister he'd heard so much of in words, but had never beheld in vision. He knew the colour of her hair, the hue of her eyes, the height of her stature, and the cheek of her behaviour, but he was excited in actually seeing her, and matching the real image against the image in his mind's eye. But when he registered her age, there was a sickness, a churning in his innards. 10 years old, nearly 20 years his junior. How would she react? Would she even see me as her brother? Devil curse me, I'm so old. I could be her uncle, her father. And then there was the issue of his stepmother. She, being married off to Tom's father aged 14, was relatively young herself, maybe only a few years older than Tom. Tom had always shunned and resented her. Every kind word was returned by a bitter remark, and every scolding was met with a defiant heedlessness. At length, perhaps Tom might have admitted that he'd hated the woman, regardless of the fact that she'd nurtured and cared for him after his mother died of a long-term illness when he was still very young. But now? He didn't know. The final issue was his current profession. He could not leave it, and, it seemed, it would prove quite a challenge to hold on to it. Tom couldn't hide it, that was for sure. Even a fairly enclosed 10-year-old would know the difference between a common sailor and the sailor that waylaid other sailors. He huffed and slouched in his seat, pulling his hat down so that a shadow fell over his face. Still brooding, Captain? Tom straightened up on hearing Malcolm's voice. Malcolm pulled out a chair and sat front-facing against the backrest, leaning his arms against the polished wood. Aye, said Tom. That's one way to put it. Oi, don't worrit yourself out, Tinker, he said, slapping the captain's arm. Ye'll make a fine brother and a fine son. Tom resisted the urge to say, I'm not her son. You reckon so? He replied, a little sarcastically, taking a sip of his rum. You reckon my sister'll make as fine a buccaneer as myself? Oh, aye, Malcolm laughed. What's wrong with ye today, eh? I ain't ever seen your face so coloured by feeling. I just worry. Malcolm indicated outwards with his chin to the dancers. Plenty of sport to remedy that. Tom glanced at them uninterested. Not my type, he mumbled. Oh, ye have types now, do ye? Said Malcolm. You must be growing old, mate. Quit your jesting, Malcolm, replied Tom, suppressing a grin. I ain't so old I can't drop an anchor in one of them harbours. But I don't know. I've to set a good example now, don't I? They were interrupted by an announcement. Captain, your ship has landed. Tom rose from his seat on hearing the caller. He watched the white sails blow gently against the mast of a fine brig. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then made motion to leave the veranda. Oi, Tinker, said Malcolm. Tom turned and waited for him to continue. You're an excellent captain, a fine sailor and a good man. The quartermaster held Tom's arm. Ye'll make a good brother too. You'll make this work, even if ye ain't yet the man of quality ye left home to become. Tom raised his brows, surprised. Thank you. He took Malcolm's hand. Thank you, Malcolm. Tom climbed down the steps, his feet feeling like lead, and yet a jittering buzz in his legs made him want to go on. As he approached the dock, he noticed his hands were shaking and his palms were beading with sweat. He touched his forehead and took a deep breath, looking at the ground for a moment. He saw something pleasing there, something that perhaps his sister, Margaret, would appreciate. He picked the exotic flowers and bunched them hurriedly before making his way to the ship. Tom took off his hat before he beheld the countenance of his sister. Margaret was not looking at him, but she stood upon the dock next to the ship, looking amazed at the vibrant Kingston. Her auburn hair, her dark blue eyes, her impish look marking her for mischief, just as had been described. But never had Tom dreamed that she would look this way. She wore a bright blue dress, and her hair was tied back lightly with a band. He smiled and carried on his way to meet her. Tom's stepmother stood next to her daughter and saw him approaching. Thomas! Mrs. McCarthy cried, smiling broadly but keeping her distance. Thomas, bless me, look at you! Madam, he nodded solemnly at his stepmother. It is good to see you. He bent his knee and held out the flowers to Margaret, smiling and cocking his head to a side. I've heard so much of ye, he said, his voice. For me? Margaret took the flowers, smiling, and sniffed them tentatively. She looked oddly at Tom. Are you my brother? She asked. Aye, that I am, Margaret. Her name felt alien to his mouth. as though it were meant only to be written and not spoken. But he relished the new feel to it. Margaret, my sister, he thought. Margaret paused a moment before saying, You look very old. I am old, he chuckled. And you wear such nice clothes, she commented, her voice curious. Papa used to talk much of you. He said all you ever dreamed of was going to the New World and making money there. It looks like you've got your dream, brother. He's not all that wrong, I'm afraid, replied Tom. I did mean to come back to ye, though. Live out my life in London, but... He turned his face away a little, his cheeks blushing with shame. Margaret nodded. I'm sure you were busy. That's a way to put it, I suppose. He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. I can't say I ain't sorry. That I didn't see you grow up and such. That I couldn't be there with ye when Papa died. That's all right, you're here now, and we'll have many adventures together, the girl giggled. You talk funny, Thomas. Aye, Tom smiled. He felt a slight stab of guilt thinking on his piracy and the people who were hunting him down, and how this could wholly change young Margaret's life for the worse. Many adventures indeed were on their way. Aye, strangeness does ye curses and blessings alike, lass. Well, will ye take care of us now? She asked. Now that Papa went away? He looked at his stepmother and then touched Margaret's face. Aye, the bars of hell couldn't stop me from looking after ye now. He looked back at Mrs. McCarthy. Both of ye. Their conversation would have continued had Malcolm not come running down to the harbour. Cap'n, he's here! Hornigold is here! Hornigold? Said Mrs. McCarthy in a worried fashion. Tom watched as his crew were already boarding the Tinker's Curse. There's no time to explain now, he said, remaining calm as he picked Margaret up and placed her on his hip. He made his way to his ship. I'll give you the details in full, madam, I swear to, but later. Mrs. McCarthy hurried up behind them. As they stepped on deck, Tom placed Margaret down, striding straight for the helm, and took the wheel, calling, Weigh anchor, lads! All hands on deck! Brace yourselves! Old Hornigold won't let us slip easy! He turned to Malcolm and said, Escort my sister and her mother to my cabin. Tell them to stay there until I give them leave to move out. Malcolm nodded. Aye, aye, Captain. Man the oars, lads, Tom bawled. And gimme some sail. Let's outrun these bastards. The ship lurched into the water, the sails being puffed with strong winds. Tom steered the ship towards the open sea, not making for any island or known location in general. It wasn't long before the pirates cried in recognition as the giant sails of several man-o'-wars could be seen chasing them. Release the barrels! The pirates at the stern lit barrels of pitch and sent them into the sea, blocking the path of the pursuing ships. A barrel exploded as one of the ships hit it, leaving a gaping hole in its hull. Two got around the barrels and covered the distance quick. Man the cannons! Barked Tom. Aim! Fire! The Tinker's Curse shook as cannon fire rained down on it. Tom braced himself for impact and then rose, shaking himself as he tightened his grip on the wheel. Aim for the mast! Aim for the rudder! He barked. Fire! There were a few loud bangs as the cannons let loose and wood splintered, becoming ablaze as the heavy balls of metal hit their mark. Tom saw sailors and marines desperately trying to douse the flames that were engulfing their sails to ash. Ready? Fire! He barked again. Another volley hit Tom's ship as he tried to sail out of range. Water, lads, water! He bawled. Get those sails out of flame! They want to fight? I'll give them a fight. Turning the wheel, Tom turned the ship around. Man the oars! He cried, setting the ship on a direct collision course with the first man-o'-war. Wood splintered, and both ships lurched on impact as the Tinker's Curse rammed into the much larger ship. Let loose the pitch, he barked, straightening his hat and walking away from the wheel. Malcolm approached his post. Take the wheel, lad, Tom told Malcolm. If this ship sinks, make sure you find my family first. Aye, Malcolm replied with uncertainty. But what are you? I'm finding that bastard and ending my business with him once and for all. McCarthy, there's no guarantee Hornigold is on one of these He's not resting in his pursuit for my head, Tom snapped. Why should I rest in my pursuit for his? Because you lack in him resources and... Enough of this, shouted Tom. Those sailors will recover from that hit in no time, and then we'll be... There was a large crashing sound, followed by a roar of flames. They turned around slowly to see a sinking man-o'-war burbling into the depths of the ocean, as if it were drowning, and in its place stood a fine galley flying a black flag. "Ahoy, Tinker!" cried the captain of the galley. "Got your hands full, have ye?" "Ahoy, quick!" replied Tom, thanking his turn in fortune. "Aye, I could use some help, but you've clearly already got that idea." "Ye brash Englishman." "I'm Irish." "Chalk and cheese, mate." The galley edged closer, flying grappling hooks onto the man-o'-war and shooting the ship down with cannon fire. The name on the ship read the Half-Caste. "I know, chalk and cheese. Lay aboard, lads," Tom yelled to his crew. "Tonight we feast on the food of quantity and don the garbs of quality." Tom nodded to Malcolm and leapt aboard, followed enthusiastically by his brutish deckhands. Soon, Captain Quick's men also boarded. Quick saw the flashing of Tom's cutlass and heard sharp cracks of his pistols. Not the most known pirate, he thought, but definitely one of the most feared. Tom carved an arc in the stomach of a marine before kicking him. He looked up and saw the captain of the sinking ship fighting valiantly to the death against 3 or 4 adversaries. He managed to cut one down, but sheer numbers soon overwhelmed him. Not that it mattered. He wasn't Benjamin Hornigold. Tom sheathed his cutlass and climbed the mast, aiming to reach the Union Jack fluttering at the top. He kicked the lookout out of his post and grabbed the flag, cutting it loose and sending it down into the sea. The pirates cheered as the sailors surrendered. "Lock 'em in the hold! Take everything that isn't nailed down!" ordered Tom. Tom climbed down and went back aboard his own ship, leaving the rest of the pirates to plunder the man-o'-war. He strode into his cabin, finding Margaret and her mother cowering in a corner. "What happened, Tom?" asked Margaret, shaking. Tom took the girl from the shivering woman's arms and placed her on a chair. "Nothing happened," he said softly. But there were bangs and cracks and tears gathered in her eyes as she tried to find something to cry about. And I think I got a splinter." She raised her forefinger up and showed him. "Oh, lass, that's nothing to worry about," he said. "Oi, don't cry, Margaret. Don't cry. There's nothing to be a-frightened of. The worst is o'er, I tell ye." But the yelling and the crashing," Margaret sobbed. "Aye, it's what sailing's about. There's a reason why Papa didn't want me to come in." As he said the words, Tom felt another stab of guilt. "I guess I am a fool," he thought. "The old man tried to warn me, rough as he was." "Listen," he told Margaret, anchoring down his own emotions. "Listen, dry up now, and I'll let ye steer my ship if the weather's favourable." You'll let me sail your boat?" "Ship," Tom corrected. "Ship. I'll let you sail my ship." She brightened. "Yay!" She bounced out of the chair and skipped out of the cabin, apparently having forgotten all her fears. "Oh, Thomas," said Mrs. McCarthy accusingly. "Oh, Thomas, what fresh hell is this?" A shiver ran down Tom's spine. "Madam, I can explain." "Yes," she hissed. "You always had an explanation for everything. Everything. How you'll explain this, though, only God in heaven knows." "Madam, a pirate, Tom. A robber of the sea. That's what's become of you, is it?" She stood up, her brows furrowed, and her teeth clenched in fury. "How will you take care of us like this, like you promised? Is your word worth nothing, Thomas? If you'd just let me... Dead at the bottom of the sea, indeed, just like your father said. But you couldn't die alone, could you?" "Oh, shut your gob, woman," Tom barked. Mrs. McCarthy recoiled. She said, her voice catching. "I should check on Maggie." She scurried past Tom. "Madam, wait," he said, pained by her reaction. But she was already gone. He sighed and looked away. "I'm sorry," he mumbled to himself. Tom sailed on for a while, leaving the carcasses of the man-o'-wars behind him to drown at sea. He wanted to put as much distance from Hornigold's trail as he could. He also wanted to distance himself from the impending argument with his stepmother. Though the journey proved a success in the first matter, it failed remarkably in the second. Mrs. McCarthy regarded Tom with cold disdain when she could, and refused to answer him when he spoke to her, whether soft or harsh. Margaret, unaware of the bitter cold war between her mother and her brother, was enjoying herself aboard the Tinker's Curse. She swung from the ropes, pitched the wheel to the side when Tom wasn't looking, setting the ship almost wildly off course, and joined in with the shanties that the other pirates sang, her voice giving a harmony the crew could otherwise never create. "Why is your boat called the Tinker's Curse, Tom?" she had asked once. "The Tinker's Curse," Tom corrected, "is a ship, Maggie, not a boat." "Yes, but why is it called that? At home, tinker isn't a nice word," Margaret explained. "Pappy used to hate it when people called him that." "Why did he, Tom? What does it mean?" Tom furrowed his brows, not knowing where to begin, and trying to keep the irritation out of his voice, he said, "Why do ye ask so many questions?" "Because she's your sister," Malcolm answered, shaking his head. There was a very noticeable problem having women aboard his ship. Having a fully male crew, Tom had little use for latrines aboard, so he'd gotten rid of them to make more space for plunder. Now, however, it was absolutely essential in maintaining the dignity of his womenfolk. Luckily, Captain Barnabas Quick was sailing alongside him. His far larger galley accommodated the facilities for female ablutions. Perhaps not for the most sophisticated of females, but still. But when he let Margaret and his stepmother board the half-caste, Tom went along with them. Quick and his crew had more honour and valour than any redcoat army could claim. But having been at sea for so long, and absent from female company, even they were subject to their urges. "Ahoy, Tinker!" said Quick. He was a tall man with a harsh face and a thick black beard. And, as the name of his ship detailed, he was mixed race. Quick was the son of a Dutch slaver and a black slave, who was recognised for her speed, hence the surname. He'd run away from a plantation in his youth, and had aligned himself to piracy since. It took a while for white men to trust him, but eventually he rose to the top, being able to snatch some of the best ships that crossed his path. "Ahoy, Quick," said Tom, stepping towards him on deck of the half-caste, the women going off to the latrines. "Your ladies need another leak?" asked Quick. Tom put a hand on his forehead, rubbing his brows with forefinger and thumb. "Aye, you know it, man. Why must ye ask every time?" "Oh, I'm sorry," said Quick, laughing and slapping Tom on the back. "Was I supposed to ask how ye were and offer ye tea?" Tom rolled his eyes, grinning a little. "Where are we headed, Quick?" "Before I give ye that detail, tell me, who's the wench aboard?" He gave Tom a saucy look. "Oi, lay off, man. That's my father's wife you're talking about." "From the way ye talked to her, it sounded like she were a weird sister come out from the very pages of the Scottish play McCarthy," replied Quick. "We've our disagreements, but keep your hands off her." Quick regarded Tom for a long while. "Fine." He folded his arms. "We're heading for an island much like Nassau, only smaller and wilder. Another republic. For pirates," said Tom, his anger fading. "Aye, run by Bonnie if you remember her," said Quick. "The British haven't found it yet, but it'd have come under Hornigold's watch by now, so don't stay too long, and be careful who ye trust there." Tom felt a tug on his clothes and turned to see Margaret and Mrs. McCarthy had returned. It was time to go back. "Fair enough. We'll follow ye there." Crossing the planks with Margaret in his arms, he called out to Malcolm. "Take the wheel, man. We're following Quick. Says he knows a place." "That's so," Malcolm called back. "What place?" Tom put Margaret down, who scuttled away to the fore and was followed hurriedly by her mother, and strode his way to the helm, standing next to Malcolm with his arms crossed, looking out to sea and watching the half-caste drop sail and move away from them. "Quick told me that Bonnie's found another island and made a new Nassau there," he said. "I'd like to see it." "Is an island of pirates a good place for your family, McCarthy?" said Malcolm, turning the wheel and barking. "Give me some sail!" to the deckhands. "I can't let him out of my sight," said Tom, "whether I like it or not." They wouldn't be safe near a civilization, where people like Hornigold might recognize him and hold him against me. He paused. It's not ideal, aye, but it's the safest place they can be. You're a stepmother. She's quite the looker, mate. Oh, come on, not you too, Tom snapped. My point was, that'll put her in danger, Tinker. Malcolm looked at him. If you want to keep her safe, make sure you keep her close, regardless of your squabblings. You suggesting that I abandon her, Malcolm? Said Tom incredulously. Malcolm narrowed his eyes. You look me in the eye and tell me you never ever given that idea a thought. Thomas stared at him, his mouth agape, but no reply came. When Quick had described New Nassau, he'd conveniently left out the details. As Tom regarded the boggy, wild island, he noted that he would rather go back to his strip of uncharted land, which had firm, solid ground, than follow Quick to the world's end. It wasn't how Tom had pictured it. In his mind, the world's end had fiery chasms spewing molten lava, and people that looked like Azazel's offspring lurking about. But New Nassau looked just about correct enough to be called that. Who needed pirate hunters? In this place, one false step and you could be swallowed by quicksand or worse, by an alligator lurking about in the murky pools. Hoping to find Bonnie, Tom's crew dropped anchor anyway on his command and set upon the marshy land. There were crates sprawled everywhere, pirates sitting on them around fires and drinking from long bottles, watching as buxom, scantily clad and drunk women entertained and danced for them. Tom took up a thankfully sleeping Margaret in his arms and walked past the entertainment, his stepmother walking a few steps behind him with a look of disgust on her face. Quick had gone off to be entertained, whilst Tom made for a tent-like structure which Quick had told him Bonnie might be in. Margaret yawned, shivering a little as the night was cold, and said, Tom? Where are we? Close your eyes, Maggie, Tom said quickly. Why? Said Margaret, excited all of a sudden, and shut her eyes. It's, a surprise? Aye, a surprise indeed, Tom muttered. But you'll find out in... Tom paused on the thought. It was a lie to accommodate his circumstance, but he reckoned it could be easily compensated. A girl like Margaret, who was so new to this world, could be surprised by anything. He beckoned Malcolm over and asked for him to order the lads to set up a tent for Margaret and her mother, which Malcolm did in a hurry, gesturing for Mrs. McCarthy to get inside and laying Margaret on her lap. Tom said, I'll be back in a minute. Don't let Maggie out. I wasn't planning to, said Mrs. McCarthy in a taut voice. The question is, will these men want to come in? I think the dancers have their attention for the minute, madam, he replied curtly. Dancers? Such a kind word for such a loathsome kind. But never to me, eh? No kind words for me. If you want to be called a dancer, madam, then why don't you go and join 'em? Can I be a dancer? Asked Margaret, her eyes still closed, remembering Tom's promise. Tom and Mrs. McCarthy shared a look of deep contempt, an argument burning on the tips of their tongues. But they restrained themselves for the sake of Margaret. Where are you going now, Tom? Mrs. McCarthy asked, keeping her voice steady. There's someone I need to see, Tom said simply. An entertainer, Thomas? Tom fumed under a nonchalant mask. No, madam, he said slowly. I need information from a woman in that tent. He pointed to the tent. About some people who are... Oh, information, of course, said Mrs. McCarthy. Because we all knew you as Thomas the Information Man back home. That isn't a thing. Well, clearly it is now. Tom sighed. Fine, whatever you think. I have information to get and I'll go get it. It shouldn't take me too long. As Tom turned to leave, she called, No, a man of your standing is bound for many quickies. He stood in his place for a moment, poked by the remark, biting air sharply through his teeth, before making for the tent again. He stood by the flap, listening a while, before taking off his hat and going in. Ahoy, Anne, he said. Anne Bonny, an infamous pirate who'd made a name for herself when she espoused the equally infamous Calico Jack and fought with the Royal Navy, before making an escape and lying low since, was surprisingly young for such an achiever. She was in her early 20s, though looking slightly older, and had dark red hair and deep green eyes. She wore a brown leather jacket over a frilled corselet and men's breeches. Sitting on the floor in her tent, Bonnie looked up at the sound of Tom's voice, being more than familiar with it, and smiled, saying, "Hey-o, Thomas, how fare ye?" "I've a problem," he sighed. Her smile dropped. "I assumed you'd come for more than just aid, Tinker." She looked down, read the sheets of paper in her hands. "Hornigold is still looking for me," he said. "Of course. Who isn't that man looking for?" "And my family have come, Anne." He paused, waiting for a... "Your family?" "Aye. My little sister and her mother. Hardly making my situation easier, but I adapt no less." He sat on the floor in front of her, putting his hat on the ground. "I have to end Hornigold's hunt. For good." "That's a mighty task you're asking for, Thomas," said Bonnie, scoffing. "Your family are more than welcome to stay here." I wouldn't want that. My sister's barely past a decade in this world, Anne. She need not see whoring, drinking and debauchery now. And her mother, she's very young, Anne. And, dare I say, she's still got beauty to her face yet. They're not safe here." "But hunting down the hunter," said Bonnie. "Thomas, you can't be serious." "I am. I need to end him," Tom insisted. "Tell me what you know about him. Where he lives, who he associates to, the people he's looking for. Tell me, Anne. If I kill him, there'll be one less snake in our garden. One less serpent in the sea." Bonnie regarded him for a while. "You'll get yourself killed, Tom." "Where would your family be then?" "Anne, I can't go about the sea and continue fighting with him. One of us has to die. If fortune favours him, then so be it. But I'll not go by without trying my luck." Bonnie sighed. "Since you're so adamant, Hornigold hasn't had a stationary home over the past few months. The pillock's been scouting the sea constantly, looking for us. Blast him, we used to call him a brother," she scowled. "A pity, aye. The last that's been seen of him, or the last I saw of him, is near Jamaica. Otherwise I've no point as to where he is. He's associated with Rogers, but you'll not see him. He's a governor now, probably on his way to Britain. As for who he's looking for, there's you, there's me, there's Quick, there's Jenkins. He's here, by the way, if you wanted to talk to him. And others. Our legends are dead already, Tom. Thatch, Rackham, Vane. You know that. Now he's just finishing the job." "Aye," sighed Tom. "I suppose I'll just have to work with what you've given me. Hopefully I'll catch a lead to follow. And hopefully you don't follow Hornigold to hell." "Aye." Tom got up to leave, putting his hat on. "Stay a bit," said Bonnie. Tom scoffed. "I can't. I've left my family over there. I promised I wouldn't be too long." "It won't take long." "Anne, calm yourself. There'll be better times later." Tom walked out, closing the flap of the tent. Tom waited a while outside Bonnie's tent, wondering whether he should go back in, when a scream rang across the island. He looked up at his family tent, seeing a drunken pirate dragging his bewildered stepmother out of the tent. Tom raced up to the scene, leaping and tackling the drunken sailor. The drunk had lost his hold on Mrs. McCarthy, and they both sprawled into the filthy, damp muck. The drunken sailor delivered a punch to Tom's jaw, making it crack. Tom spat blood and filth into the sailor's eye, headbutting him in the nose. "Are you mad, man?" Tom shouted. "Lay off me, mate, I'm well chaffed," said the man. "That was my father's wife you had, screaming her guts out in your hands." He punched the man. "Your father's wife, you say?" The man chuckled, the drunken slur in his voice indicating he hadn't quite taken in the gravity of the matter. "A pretty wench like that, I wager she's sick of your old man. You're old yourself. Your father must have had a good time with that one." "Don't talk of my father that way, ye sorry bastard. The hell is wrong with you?" "Why? What are you going to do about it?" The man rolled Tom over in the mud, sitting on his chest and straddling him, pressing his fingers in his throat. "Eh? Why don't you cry out for your pappy and your mammy now?" Tom stared at him, his face turning red in a struggle for breath. He gritted his teeth, reaching for the dagger in his sleeve. Grasping the hilt with both hands, seeing spots appear in his line of vision, Tom stabbed the man at the bottom of his spine. The man threw his head back and howled, releasing hold. Tom took a moment to fill his lungs, punching the man hard in his exposed throat. He choked, grasping his neck, coughing and spluttering. Tom sheathed his dagger again and panted as he sat up. Something was wrong. The man continued to choke, and Tom watched in disbelief as the man reached for him with a shaky hand. Not to hurt him, Tom realized, but asking for help. I couldn't have hit him that hard, could I? Tom thought, taking the man's hand. Oi, what's wrong? Said Tom, shaking him. Say something. The man tried to gasp, clasping his throat and moving his fingers in an attempt to try and fix what Tom had clearly damaged. His eyes began to flutter, his tongue sticking out and wagging. It wasn't long before he fell on his face, unmoving. No, Tom thought, his eyes wide. No, no, no! Tom, called the voice he least wanted to hear in this situation. What's wrong with him? Nothing, Maggie, he said in a tone which denoted the complete opposite. Nothing. Nothing. Tom's eyes could not move from the body of the fellow pirate. Get up, we have to go. He looked at Mrs. McCarthy, his face pale with panic. We have to go now. Mrs. McCarthy, still quite shaken, took her daughter by the hand and headed in the direction of the ship, avoiding the other passed out and drunk pirates. Tom looked for Malcolm, who was still very sober. The lad's precautious, bless him, Tom thought. Malcolm, he said. Malcolm looked at his captain. You all right, Tinker? You look like you've seen a ghost. Round the lads up. We have to leave. What? Why? Damn it, man. There's no time to explain now. Find Quick, too. Tell him to tag along. If not now, then soon. I need to talk to him. He paused and turned away. I've done a bad. Rain began to fall hard as the Tinker's curse cut through the ocean in a hurry. Tom manned the wheel, twisting and turning it around the scarce patches of land that appeared in the sea. The rain drenched his hair and clothes, making everything heavier and harder to do. It was a night to spend on land, the weather as it was. There was a possibility of a storm coming on, and Tom's crew would not fare well in such an occurrence. But Tom had no choice. A life of piracy held few rules, but those rules were still meant to be obeyed. He had killed a fellow pirate, and if he was caught by the captain, or if the rest of his crew found out, he could be marooned, left on an uninhabitable island with a keg of rum and a pistol loaded with a single bullet. Nothing more, with only one inevitable option. If the consequences fell only on himself, perhaps he wouldn't have been so worried. But with his family at stake, what would become of them, of little Margaret? Captain, said Malcolm. Tom almost jumped out of his skin. He paused to take a breath. Don't do that. Malcolm gave him a look. We should dock. This weather'll take a few turns. Tom shook his head. Can't. He barked to his crew. Are you mad? Don't put the sails down, damn it! What happened? Tom didn't look at Malcolm as he replied. An accident. Captain? Thunder crackled from above. Promise me you won't tell the rest of the crew. What? Promise me. I didn't hear. Tom's confession dropped out of his mouth like a bullet. I've done something terrible, Malcolm. A pirate on that island tried to take my stepmother, and I killed him. I didn't mean to, I only meant to beat him hard, but I killed him. He rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, as if that would clear his vision. Christ, what am I going to do? You did what? Malcolm burst out, staring at his captain. Shh, said Tom. I know. Who was the man? Damn it, Tinker. I told ye to keep her close. Oh, shut your hole. You know how she is. I went off to talk with Anne and... To talk? Aye, to talk. Nothing else. I went to get information about Hornigold. Well, it's a right pickle you've put yourself in. Until we find out who he is, we won't know who else is after ye, said Malcolm, taking the wheel. Ye go talk to your stepmam, eh? Calm down. This is no light matter, but there's nothing we can do about it now. Tom paused, regarding Malcolm. Sometimes I wonder if you should have become the captain of this ship. Then he walked off to his cabin. He opened the door, seeing Margaret sleeping soundly in his crib. Mrs. McCarthy stroked her hair with one hand, looking intently at the girl, but bearing a distanced look in her eyes, as if she wasn't quite there, on the ship, in the cabin next to Margaret. Tom thought he could see where exactly she was. In their house in London, a young woman in an old man's home. Tom stood by the door some more, rainwater pouring in and speckling the clean wooden floor, and sighed. He stepped in, his sodden boots making dark prints and squelching as he moved, and shut the door behind him. He stripped off his jacket, the tunic underneath no less wet than his coat, and hung it up on a hook. Then he sat in a corner and pulled off his boots, leaving his drenched self leaning against the walls, his head tossed back and staring at the ceiling. Too many things going on, too many things to contend. You killed him, didn't you? Asked Mrs. McCarthy. Tom paused, exhausted by the day and by his emotions, and didn't look at her when he said, Ye saw him die, madam. Why must ye ask me? She began, but she stopped. There was a long silence between the two. Tom could see in his mind's eye his stepmother turning away from him, planning to run away with Margaret, swim to shore and just disappear from his life. It hurt him. It stabbed him deeper than any cutlass or bullet could. So harsh was the image that he curled up in that corner, like the little boy that Mrs. McCarthy knew all too well, and cried. He cried because he'd lost his father. He cried because he was being hunted down by a turncoat. He cried because he'd killed a fellow pirate. But most of all, Tom cried because he was afraid of losing the only blood he had left, his sister. With her around, no matter how small, young or mischievous she was, there was something to live for, something to build a life on, a purpose to a broken life. With Margaret, there was hope. But all his memories, all his old, painful memories, tightened his chest like a vice. I never should have left home. Mrs. McCarthy just sat and stared, not knowing what to do or how to react. Deep down, she knew that Tom regretted his wrongs and misgivings. But Tom hated being scolded. He hated it even more when Quick was scolding him. You killed a pirate! Quick howled. They were in a cabin aboard the half-caste, alone, and Tom was grateful for it. Quick was raging around, breaking some of his trinkets as he bawled at Tom. A fucking pirate, McCarthy! Of all fucking people! Tom looked at his boots and rubbed his forehead, mumbling, I didn't mean to. I don't give a damn if you blooming well hadn't meant to! Quick bent forward, deep lines forming on his brow, and his arms spread wide as if to slap Tom on both sides of his face. I should string you up for it, mate. Will I be wrong in doing that? Tom looked at him, his jaw set. No matter what Tom said, nobody wanted to listen. So he just stared at Quick as he cursed and muttered and kicked things over in his anger. It took a while for Quick to calm down. He sat down at last and pulled out a bottle of rum from a casket he'd shattered. Fuck, he muttered, pulling out the cork and taking a swig. Tom still didn't say anything, tilting his head to the side. Go on, said Quick gruffly. I'm done. What do you need? Tom tapped the table with his knuckles and said, Whose man did I kill? Captain Jenkins, and he ain't happy about it. You killed his quartermaster, and some say Nancy boy. He don't know it's you, but I bet he suspects it, the way you took off in that bleeding storm last. Jenkins, Tom mused. He brushed the stubble on his chin with his forefinger. Jenkins was not a man to be trifled with. He was a stout, harsh man, not the merriest pirate to sail the seven seas. Of all people, it had to be him. Shut your ass, Tinker, Quick glowered at him. You were the man who killed the pirate. Tom sighed. What am I supposed to do? Run, said Quick. Run where? Said Tom, following after him. Quick turned. You're asking me as though I'm going to help you get there? I was supposing you... I'm not, Quick snapped. What ye did is a big thing, Tinker. Now, don't get me wrong, I like you, lad. I think highly of ye. But I'm not about to make an enemy of Jenkins for ye. You're on your own. He pointed out to sea. Now get off my ship. Tom met Malcolm on the helm of the Tinker's Curse, pale and speechless. I take it there's no luck with Quick then, said Malcolm. Turn around, we're going back to New Nassau. Malcolm gave him a look for a long moment, not turning the wheel. Tom sighed and took the wheel from him and turned the ship. Malcolm took a step back. The crew are going to be wondering, Tinker, why ye led them through a storm over 2 days just so ye could turn back the way ye came. I killed Jenkins' man. Oh, no. He'd have come out looking for me, Malcolm. The only way is back. It's the last place he'd look. The last place he'd find me. Captain? Aye. Malcolm gave his captain a long, hard look. This is not going to... Tom was turning in for the night. Malcolm offered to steer the ship and wake him a few hours later. As he took off his coat and entered the cabin, Tom found his stepmother waiting for him. She was washing clothes in a bucket as Margaret snoozed in his cot. Tom glanced at Mrs. McCarthy. She was staring at him as he entered, but didn't say anything. Margaret had been awfully sedated for the last few days, and he'd begun to wonder whether his sprightly little sister had figured a few things out, or whether Mrs. McCarthy had told her. He didn't think on it for too long, however. He sat in the corner, pulling off his tunic and picking up a bottle of rum. He drank it slowly, the sweet narcotics seeping through his taste buds and slithering down his throat. He shook his head and sighed. Pass me your tunic, Thomas, said Mrs. McCarthy. He looked at her for a minute, and then kicked the item of clothing in her direction. She sighed, but got up and took it from the floor and dipped it in her bucket, holding the worn cloth between her hands and giving it a hard scrub. She wished she had some of that Turkish soap. Ever considered a bath, Tom? She asked. You really stink. He grunted and frowned. I think that, living surrounded by water, you'd think more on your hygiene. Just a thought, you know. Tom squinted an eye at her. What do you want, madam? She gazed at him. Just a chat, Thomas. Would you blame me for doubting it? She hesitated. No. Then I doubt it. He took another swig. What else could I possibly want out of you? Oh, I don't know, he said. 2 men are searching the ocean for me. They want to take my life and my dignity. It's not like there's much else ye could have from me. But I suppose if you'd like to take a sharp poke, madam, here's your chance. There's no telling when I'm about to die. He looked away. Mrs. McCarthy's shoulders sagged. Thomas? He looked at her. You're a pillock. He sighed. Aye. And drank. But you're a good pillock, she said, resuming her scrubbing. A determined pillock. A caring pillock. I never knew there were so many kinds of pillock, madam. You invented them all. You can carve it in me tombstone, eh? At least I'd be remembered for something. Thomas. She dropped the tunic in the bucket and put her hands in her lap and looked at him. I know you were ne'er fond of me. I knew it as soon as I stepped into your father's house. She looked away. But a few days ago, you killed a man for me. She looked up, as if the ceiling would help her search for the words she was trying to say. I'm sorry, all right? He furrowed his brows at her. For what? For not thanking you. Ye can hold your thanks, madam. I've put ye in more trouble than ye bargained for. You'll be cursing me yet. Just wait. I don't want to do that, Thomas. Then what do ye want? She got up and sat in front of him. I want my son back. You ne'er had a son. I always thought I did, Thomas. She took his hand. Even if you ne'er saw me as your mam. Tom battered her hand away. You were ne'er my mother, he said in a small voice. Not then, and not now. Thomas. No. Mrs. McCarthy sighed and backed up a little. Fine. I'm sorry. Nothing else. He turned his face away. She saw a small tear roll down his cheek, cutting through the grime the day's work had. You were 4 years older than I when ye stepped into my house, he said, holding the bottle close to his mouth. My mother hadn't been buried for more than 2 months, and he got you. He looked around searchingly. God, I loved her. Her voice, her touch, the way she always knew everything. Then the illness came. It took her voice, it took her touch. But she still knew everything. She still did everything. And she still loved me. My father loved me then too. And then she died. And everything else. He sniffed and looked up, gasping, as if saying such things were pressing down on his throat, his lungs, constricting his breathing. Everything else died with her. The illness had taken the beauty from her face. But when they buried her, she was smiling. I remember that ghost to a smile. I wonder if she was thinking of me when she died. I hope so. I want her to be happy with me. He blinked, and more tears streamed down his face. And then you came, he said, looking at his stepmother, and everything changed. All my father ever thought about was you. He ne'er played games with me, ne'er took me fishing, not like he used to when Mam was around. He ne'er beat me either until you came. It was as if it hurt him to look at me, because every time he did, he'd frown. When I spoke, he'd just say, aye, aye. That's it. Ne'er anything else. Unless I'd broken something, or hurt one of the neighbours, or spilled my guts out behind a tavern. All he cared about was you, madam. The bitterness left his voice. You can't change that. I'll ne'er love you. But because of Maggie, and because she's my sister, and because ye're her mother, I'll look after ye where and when I can, to the best of my ability. But, mother, he got up and walked away. I only e'er had one, and she's gone. He shrugged. I suppose I'll be joining her soon. So that's something to look forward to. Margaret was sitting quietly at the helm as Tom steered his ship. Malcolm was taking a nap, and Mrs. McCarthy was in Tom's cabin, fussing over his disorganized items. Tom? Tom sighed. Margaret. I'm bored. That's nice. She kicked his leg and laughed. Oi, he said, shuffling slightly away from her. I want to do something. Then go do something. But what should I do? Tom paused. Sleep. I'm not tired. Eat. I'm not hungry. Piss. I'm not desperate. He took off his hat and put it on her head, the afternoon sun making his light hair gleam. Go and sing with the lads. I'm not in a sing-songy mood. Tom rolled his eyes and turned the wheel. Come and help me then, I'll show you how. She smiled and got up to take the wheel. Tom stood back, still gripping the spokes as Margaret turned the wheel and Tom tried to guide it. Will you tell me a story? She asked, making sharp turns. Tom grunted. What kind of story? About you. Me? Yes. He scoffed. I've no stories of myself, Maggie. Have you ever seen a pretty mermaid? Some say they have, but I ne'er seen one. And they aren't always nice, he said, yawning. Legend has it they put sailors out of their ships and drown 'em for food. Margaret's face blanched, and she looked up at Tom. They do that? That's not very nice. No, Tom snorted. But like I said, I ne'er seen one. I hope we don't ever see one if they're that mean. There was a long pause. The soft sound of the waves and the murmurs of the singing pirates being the only things filling the silence. I've a story for you, Maggie, said Tom. You do? Aye, he said. But I'll have to ask you to sit down, please. She sat back down and waited. There was once a man named Edward Thatch. Teach? No, Thatch, with a hard tha at the beginning. He used to be a privateer, a sailor when Spain and England were at war. Spain and England were at war? Said Margaret, surprised. Are you going to let me tell the story or not? Sorry. When the war was over, Thatch didn't like the fact that our German King George took the British throne. So he stole a galley, and a fine galley it was. He called it the Queen Anne's Revenge after our British Queen Anne. He made his home on the island of Nassau with another man named Benjamin Hornigold. Thatch was a fearsome man. He was. I remember him. He was tanned and tall, as broad as our Malcolm. He had a big black beard and liked to wear 12 pistols in his belt. 12 pistols, Tom? Tom looked amused. Aye, it is. Did you meet him? I ne'er talked with him, but I saw him in his galley. Did you run away? No, Maggie, Tom laughed. You see, Thatch was a man that was nice to his own people. I was his own people, so he left me alone. He liked to steal Spanish ships, but he didn't like killing people. He used to scare his enemies. Like, really scare them, Maggie. It's not nice to steal, Tom. Why did he do that? Because... Tom paused. Because the Spanish had taken stuff from him, he told her, feeling bad. He wondered for a moment how his stepmother would react if Margaret told her the story. But anyway, I was told that he used to put slow-burning fuses in his hat and in his big black beard to appear the devil, so his enemies were too scared to fight him. Didn't his hair catch fire? I suppose it did, Tom laughed. But I'll ne'er know for sure. He used to drink his rum with half a cup of gunpowder too. At one time, he locked his crew below deck whilst fire and brimstone burnt on top. He wanted to see who was the most fit. He sounds like a madman to me. He probably was a little bit. But he stopped for a while. He'd become old and he'd stopped. But they came for him anyway and killed him and his crew. Who came for him? Tom paused. People, Maggie. I'm not entirely sure who. Hornigold, Tom thought to himself. Hornigold sold the man out. But he fought valiantly to the death. His last words, memorable ones, I'm told. What did he say? He gave Margaret a sad look. In a world without gold, we might have been heroes. Captain! Cried Malcolm. Tom hadn't noticed he'd come out of his cabin. Captain, it's Jenkins! Jenkins is a-coming! The rest of the deckhands looked confused at the quartermaster's outcry. Tom waited for Malcolm to walk up to the helm and moved away to allow the sailor to steer the ship for him. He took out his spyglass and searched the sea, seeing the Grudge approach. Jenkins' ship was a brig like his own. If Tom was lucky, it wasn't as well equipped for a fight as the Tinker's Curse. Captain, said Malcolm in a worried fashion, what should we do? We meet him, Tom said. Turn the ship around and ram that bastard. Jenkins' ship, the Grudge, must have predicted that the Tinker's Curse was set on a collision course. Tom heard a man bark, "Fire!" and he braced himself for the impact of cannonballs raining down on them. A pirate died with a scream on his lips as a cannon struck him straight in the face. Tom's men looked around in confusion, slightly dazed as Tom instructed them to put out the fires and ready themselves for battle. There was a buzzing murmur everywhere amid the sharp cries of pain and the steady rushing of panic. Why were they being attacked by another pirate? Had Jenkins joined Hornigold? Had he turned coat? Wood splintered, clouds of dust rising as both ships collided. The four of the Tinker's Curse ploughing into the side of the Grudge. Tom took his hat and told Margaret to join her mother in the cabin. He told her he would be with them soon. She nodded, her face paling, and scurried off. Tom drew his sword and ran along the banister of his ship, agile as a gecko trying to climb onto the Grudge and engage with Jenkins' crew. Almost blindly, as they didn't really understand what was going on, Tom's crew followed and joined him. Tom leapt onto a man and struck him clean through the chest. He died without so much as a howl. Pulling his cutlass out quick, he slashed the throat of a fast-approaching adversary, his blood spraying like a fountain as he flailed back. Tom gasped sharply as something hard hit him on the head, and a blade cut through the flesh of his shoulder. The captain looked at the protruding blade, half with fear, half with curiosity, and turned to meet his attacker, his sword catching sunlight. Captain Jenkins snarled at him. Ducking back to avoid the sharpened blade, Tom sliced to the other side and slammed down, but Jenkins caught the sword with his own the first time and skittered away so that the blade stuck in the wood of the deck. Tom cursed, pulling out his pistols, but Jenkins thrust the hilt of his sword into Tom's chin. Tom pulled the trigger and shot himself in the foot. He howled, and Jenkins pressed the blade of his sword close to Tom's neck. holding him in an iron grip. "Stop, ye tosspots, or I'll kill him," he barked. "Ye hear me, Tinker's men? Drop your knives or there's nothing left for ye." Tom threw his head back and caught Jenkins in the nose with a sharp headbutt. Jenkins grunted, blood dripping from the torn skin, but didn't lose his grip. "Ye sorry bastard," he said, spitting into Tom's face. "Ye killer man, and now ye try to hide your guilt with heroism? I've ne'er seen a thing so pathetic." Tom rasped, trying desperately to get free as the blade pressed harder against his throat. The pain in his shoulder and foot began to overwhelm him. "Let me go, Jenkins, and fight like a man." "I'll do as I please, Tinker," Jenkins barked, shaking the man in his grasp. "I should kill ye for what ye did. Your own men are loath to support ye. Look at them." He glowered at Tom. Tom looked at his crew, their anger and heroism turning quickly to confusion. "But I know the rules, Tinker, and I'll follow 'em. Aye, even if ye're reluctant to." "What happened on that island was a mistake, Jenkins," said Tom, still trying to "A mistake indeed," bawled Jenkins, spittle flying into Tom's eyes. "And you'll regret it." Jenkins gestured to his men, who skipped across to the Tinker's Curse, climbing along the fore like acrobats, and torched the sails. The tough fabric caught, and soon tongues of flame slowly ate through them. Others went to break the rudder and take what cargo there was. They pushed the cannons into the sea, throwing the gunpowder over as well, the heavy equipment splashing into the raging waves. All they left was some rum and remnants of food. Tom's crew didn't do anything. "Ye killed a man, Captain," said one of his men who seemed taken by such a revelation. "Ye killed a pirate?" The crew began whispering among themselves. It explained everything. Why their captain had decided to sail away from New Nassau in a storm, and why he'd been journeying back with such haste. One by one, Tom saw them dropping their weapons and walking away from him. Tom didn't protest. It was the setback of a democratic system. He had made them work hard, he had deceived them, and he had lost their trust. Jenkins pushed him along the fore of the Tinker's Curse and threw him onto the deck, where he lay sprawled for a moment. Malcolm grunted and helped Tom to sit up. He looked at him with worry, but didn't say anything. Jenkins was standing over them, looking down with disgust. "Ye are marooned, ye traitors!" He spat at them and walked off. "God forgive ye the things ye've done." "I'll get you, Jenkins, and when I do, I'll gut you, and then tear your organs out and make a garland out of them," cried Malcolm, standing at the fore as the Tinker's Curse floated aimlessly through the sea. Tom stood at the helm, leaning against the useless wheel, his shoulder and foot freshly bandaged by his stepmother, who was currently sitting in the cabin rocking Margaret to a restless sleep. "Stop your goddamn howling, Malcolm. Ye ain't helping yourself." Malcolm turned sharply to him. "Ah, the great Captain McCarthy speaks," he said, raising his hand in mock dramatics. "Pray tell us, Captain, what genius brought ye to sail a ship with no sails and no rudder?" He turned back to the open sea in the general direction where Jenkins had left. "I'll get you, cowards!" "I said, shut your gob." The island was beautiful. It had a golden beach, the sand shimmering in the half-risen sun, the blue ocean lapping over its banks. The jungle beyond, free and untamed, harboured animals, iguanas and ocelots, who came into view briefly, then slipped away. Tom dragged his feet towards the spot where Mrs. McCarthy and Margaret were sitting, shaded by a tree with vast leaves. He was holding the hem of his tunic up with both hands, carrying a food source, but he stumbled, dropping the oysters he had fished out of the sea. They dotted the sand like pebbles, glistening with wetness. Tom cursed something under his breath. Margaret, having finally lost faith in him, was grumbling and helping him to pick them up. "Oysters again?" she asked, looking at him with a cross expression. They had left the Tinker's Curse to wander the sea on its own, taking one of her small canoes and rowing up to a strip of land that Tom had never come upon before. He suspected it was near New Providence, but he couldn't be sure. They had taken a few barrels of rum and dried food with them, but the food had long since run out, and the rum they savoured to the drop. Mrs. McCarthy hadn't said much, but Margaret, who had become frightened with the mutiny and successively angry at Tom's following actions, had lost her patience. Every word was a mutter or a grumble or a groan or a sigh. She didn't look 10 years old anymore. "Where did Malcolm go?" asked Mrs. McCarthy. "Ye haven't seen him?" asked Tom, taking a small knife and cracking open an. The creature snapped down on his hand, and Tom yelled a curse. He saw Margaret recoil at the word. No matter how many cuts he got from resilient oysters, they never failed to get curses out of him. No, said Mrs. McCarthy. "If you do, tell me," said Tom with a gruff shrug. "The man's a raving lunatic since he set foot on this island. He ain't safe." "And you are, Tom?" asked Margaret. He looked at her, not in a sensitive mood at all, and didn't say anything. "I suppose you're not a gentleman then, like you always told us in your letters." "I'm not having this discussion with ye, Maggie." "Why not? I'm too little? Too stupid?" He got up and walked back to the water. Margaret followed him. "Tom," she shouted, "why did you lie to us? What are you really? A thief like Edward Teach or Tatch or whatever?" "Thatch," said Tom, trying to control the volume of his voice. "Aye." He looked at her, knee-deep in water. "Aye, I'm a pirate." He spread his arms. "I've lived my life ending others and stealing what they hold. That's what I am. Nothing less than that." "I wonder if there is anything less than that." He shook his head, unprepared for an argument with his sister, and turned away, seeing a crab scuttling along the seabed. He knelt down, trying his best not to stir the water. His hands poised for grabbing the creature. And just as his hands flew into the water to crush the crab, "Papa was right about you!" Tom slipped and fell into the water face first. The water bubbled up as he yelled, and he came back up in a sitting position, the crab holding onto his nose with one of its sharp claws. It let go, jumped back into the water with a soft splash, and scuttled away. Tom spat seawater and glared at Margaret. She did not look amused. "Papa always said..." Tom stood up. "If I wanted to know," he said, turning away and walking further into the sea, "I'd have asked." Margaret stepped into the water, the tattered ends of her dress floating as she followed Tom. She snorted. "He always said that you were a troublemaker." "Go back to shore, Maggie," said Tom, seeing her approach from the corner of his eye. Her bare feet felt the soft sand underwater, and the slippery pebbles eroded to perfection. She saw clusters of small fish swim by her toes. She ventured on until the water was up to her chest. "He said you always got in trouble with the landlord, with the tavern keeps, with your boss." "Go back to your mammy, Margaret." "He said," Margaret continued hotly, "that maybe it was a good thing that you went away." Tom paused and turned around to look at her. "That's a lie," he mumbled. "No," she said, crossing her arms and tilting her head to the side. "I heard Mama and Papa talking once. He said that maybe it was a good thing that you went away, because all you ever did was get into trouble." Tom turned away. His eyes narrowed. "Go back to shore," he said, weakly pointing to the shade of the tree. "He was right, wasn't he?" Margaret said. "You took us, you promised you'd look after us. And look where you've brought us, Tom." Tom gritted his teeth in silence. "And everything you told us in your letters were lies, everything." She took another step forward and slipped, her head slapping the water before going under. Bubbles broke the surface as she tried to scream, her clothes soaking and becoming heavy with water. She writhed and tried to get up, but to no use. Tom skipped his way towards her, hurrying along with wide eyes, and pulled her up. She coughed and spluttered and panicked. Mrs. McCarthy hurried along the bank as Tom took the girl to her mother. Mrs. McCarthy looked up at Tom with a questioning gaze as she took Margaret from him. He sighed as they walked back to the shade, Mrs. McCarthy trying to soothe her frantic daughter, and turned back to get more food from the sea. The clouds drifted through the dark sky, heavy with rainwater, just waiting to be unburdened. Margaret was asleep, Tom's coat covering her as she snoozed the events of the day away. Tom was sitting and eating a piece of fish. It was good fish, but it had too many bones, and every time one got stuck in his gums, he had to make an elaborate display of breaking every single table manner there was. Mrs. McCarthy sat back and didn't eat anything. "Thomas," she mumbled. He looked up, his forefinger and thumb still trying to pry out the bone. "Madam?" "Stop that." He took his hand out and closed his mouth, running his tongue along his gums. "Stupid fish," he muttered. She sighed. "Come here." He shuffled towards her and opened his mouth. She wrinkled her nose at the smell of his breath, but took out the bone anyway. "Thank you," he muttered, moving back. "Are you all right?" she asked, hugging her knees. "Aye," he said softly, seeming nonchalant. "Why shouldn't I be?" "Well, you killed a man. You got abandoned by your friend. One of your other friends hunted you down. Your crew mutinied against you. And Malcolm has gone senile." Tom made a face. "Shut up." Mrs. McCarthy gave him a look. "I heard what Margaret said, Thomas." He looked away and didn't say anything. "It's true. Your father did say all of that." "Good to know," Tom muttered. "But your father was angry, Tom," said Mrs. McCarthy. "A great comfort." Mrs. McCarthy sighed. "He was angry because he—" Tom looked at her. It was a sour and beaten down look. "You're just saying that." She shook her head, putting a hand on his shoulder. "No, your father was a rough man, Thomas. He was a man who was hard to love. He found it hard to love others too." She smiled at him sadly. "He didn't like to show his weaknesses, lad, but he still loved you. And I don't think he died begrudging you your mistakes." "You can't know for sure," Tom sighed. "I was his wife, Thomas," she laughed. "I think my opinion counts." He frowned. "Aye." He nodded to Margaret. "But ye're her mother," he said, looking back at Mrs. McCarthy. "And ye thought I tried to drown her today." Tom's stepmother paused. "No, Thomas, I wasn't." "Ye look me in the eye and tell me ye didn't think it, madam." She looked at him searchingly and then said, "It was an idea that entered my mind, yes. But I didn't believe it, Thomas." "There's a doubt in your mind about me," he said. She withered. "But it'll always stay there, I guess. That was a hell of my own making." He turned his back and lay down on the sand, closing his eyes and waiting for sleep. A hand touched his forehead and brushed back his hair. He tried to shake it away, but to no avail. A soft voice rang in his ears as the hand stroked. "Come all ye jolly mariners that love to take a drum, all ye a robber that o'er the seas did come." He wrote a letter to his king the 11th of July to see if he'd accept him for his jolly company. "Oh now, says the king, such things they cannot be. They tell me you're a robber of the sea." Oh, they sailed up and they sailed down, so stately, blind and free, till they spied the king's high reindeer like a leviathan on the sea. "Why lie ye here, ye tinker, ye silly cowardly thief? Why lie ye here, ye tinker, and hold our king in grief?" They fought from 1 in the morning till it was 6 at night, until the king's high reindeer was forced to take her flight. Go home, ye tinkers, tell ye your king for me, though he reign upon dry land, I will reign upon the sea. Tom paused. He'd never heard the song being sung by a woman. Usually it was a lot of his men crowded around a fire drinking rum, setting it to music and singing it. And usually Tom was too drunk to even register the words. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask Mrs. McCarthy how she knew the song and why she had sung it to him. But she wouldn't know, Tom guessed. She had probably learnt it from his crew, or from Margaret, and was only singing it to cheer him up, because she felt bad about what Margaret had said, about suspecting him of trying to drown his little sister. Still, "Thank ye," he mumbled. As her hand receded, Tom could almost feel her smile at him. It rained on the unnamed island profusely for 3 consecutive days. Tom and his family had retreated into the jungle, taking shelter from the downpour in the trees and under natural rock structures. Margaret seemed to have developed a burning fever, her temperature rising high at random moments. She cried a lot and threw up after she ate. Mrs. McCarthy looked worried about it, and Tom felt the same way. Lightning flashed before their eyes before thunder crackled above. Tom, his hair matted down and dripping, looked up. Terrible weather for sailing. He smiled at the stray thought. Margaret touched his hand, and he looked at her. "Maggie?" he said, picking her up and holding her close. Her forehead burned against the skin of his chest. "I'm scared," she said, sneezing. "Bless ye," Tom muttered back and yawned. "Don't be. The storm will clear up soon enough." "How do you know?" Tom shrugged. "I don't. I'm only saying so you'll stop being scared." Mrs. McCarthy pinched his arm hard, and he recoiled. "Will we stay here forever?" asked Margaret. "Are we going to die here, Tom?" "I don't know, Maggie." She pulled away and looked up at him. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "About, Thunder crackled again, and she clung to Tom, shutting her eyes tight. Tom sighed. "Ain't near." Tom got out of the jungle when the storm cleared. It was a chilly morning. He'd instructed Mrs. McCarthy and Maggie to stay where they were, keep warm, and he'd be back with food if he could find any. Tom squelched through the thick, damp sand, trying his best not to sink in. His toes had masses of wet sand between them, and it wasn't comfortable. But then he looked up at the shore, and all thoughts of his comfort vanished. A wrecked ship lay beached there. Planks of broken boards and other debris lay sprawled around it, and the hull had a gaping hole. The corpses of deckhands littered the golden beach, some still floating in the water. Tom made his way to the ship, taking what he could. A cutlass from one body, 2 pistols from another, and flasks of rum from each and every. The deckhands wore yellow livery. A Spanish ship, then. Or not. The washed-out plaque of the ship read, "The Benjamin." Tom frowned at the sign. "He's here. This is his ship." One of the corpses next to him groaned and turned. Tom kicked him. From all the howling he did, the corpse seemed very much alive, and leant down to ask, "When did ye land here?" "What?" said the man. He sounded very British despite his uniform. "When did ye get here?" The man paled when he saw the sight of Tom. Pirate!" he cried. "Shut your arse," Tom barked, scowling at the man. "There ain't no one here to save ye, so shut it." The man gulped and nodded. Tom rasped a loud sigh and said for the 3rd time, "When did ye get here?" I don't know, sir." Tom rolled his eyes. "Did ye have anyone aboard?" he said, "apart from soldiers?" "I don't know what you mean, sir." Holding his patience and trying to look nonchalant, Tom straightened and put his hands on his hips, saying, "Was Captain Hornigold aboard?" The man looked confused, and then defensive. "What do you want with him?" "Getting bold, are ye?" Tom sneered at the man, and he cowered back. "It's none of your business what I want with a man. I asked if he's here. Tell me he is if he is, or tell me he ain't if he ain't. You lie, and I'll cut you. You play the hero, and I'll cut you. You play a bloody idiot, and I'll really cut you." "God save me," he cried, trying to crawl away. "And flay, you devils!" "You ain't particularly fast at crawling, you know," said Tom, striding up to the man, taking his hair and yanking him back. "Hey, ow! Stop that!" "Gimme answers." Yes, Captain Hornigold is here, yes." "Did he go anywhere?" "I don't know, ow!" Tom shook the man's head, feeling hair tear from the man's scalp as he did so. "Tell me." The man had tears in his eyes. "I swear I don't know. He might be dead in the ship somewhere, but if he isn't, then he's probably gone away. In the jungle or along the beach. He's not so easy to kill, our captain." Tom threw his head away, rubbing his hands together and pointing off the island. "Round up your survivors. Take one of your boats, and get off this island. You hear me? The man looked at Tom, surprised. You mean you're letting me go? Tom bellowed. The man crawled up and ran the length of the beach before looking confused, turning back, and checking the bodies of the Marines. Tom shook his head and looked at the sand. Footprints. Could it be? Has fortune shined on me at last? He looked up at the sky as if an answer would be scrawled into the heavens for him. I might die here, and my family with me. If Hornigold is here, by God I'm going to find him, and when I do. He took off in the direction of the footprints, leaving the wreckage behind him. As Tom stumbled through the jungle, the ground became more solid, the earth damp and muddy. The air became denser, a moist quality hanging over him as drops of water slipped off leaves and dripped onto his face and shoulders. The footprints carried on still. He crouched down, running his hands along the markings. The prints were still fresh, and dragging lines indicated that Hornigold was either injured or stumbling along the path, or he was running from something, not too cautious of where he was going. Paying mind to the latter idea, Tom saw a new set of footprints, bigger and more uncoordinated, following the line of Hornigold's, and these new pair of feet were by no means animal. Malcolm, Tom thought, raising his head and continuing his search. Malcolm's gone after him. Tom fought down a recently frequent emotion, guilt. Malcolm was insane. Quite frankly, if Hornigold so wished it, the madman could be dead. The idea of Malcolm's death made Tom curse and speed forward as wet leaves slapped his face and twisted roots made him trip and stumble. Birds and ocelots jumped out of his way as he scrambled past them, iguanas having scuttled away moments before. Tom tried jumping over a fallen log, but fell, only adding to his shame by crying, "Damn!" The birds squawked and flew out the trees at the sound of his voice. This was normal. What was not normal, however, was the agonized howl that responded to his curse. Bewildered, Tom got up and continued in a hurry. He broke through the clearing just in time to see Malcolm laughing as Hornigold slashed a blade across his face. Malcolm fell back, putting a hand to the wound and giggling at the blood that stained his palm, as if it was merely paint. Dead man, he said. Dead man. Hornigold turned. He was a tall man with the rugged appearance of an experienced sailor. He had dark hair tied back with a ribbon, several scars marking his face, and a long blue coat that had clearly seen better days. He regarded Tom. Pirate, he said, a brow raised. Turncoat, said Tom, gritting his teeth and ripping his cutlass out of its scabbard. Hornigold paused, and then laughed, turning fully to his new adversary. Which one are you, then? Quick's the dark one, I know that much. He held his sword poised. Jenkins is the broad one. Bonnie's the woman. Which one are you? I don't suppose you're a captain of any kind. He laughed and struck forward, putting his weight into. Tom sidestepped the blow and lashed out to his side. Hornigold caught it with ease. Tom struck again, and their swords were locked. I'm Captain Thomas McCarthy, the Tinker. Tom spat. And your end, Hornigold. Hornigold scoffed. I doubt that, Tinker. He loosened the hold and threw Tom off. Tom lost his balance, but managed to kick the blade out of the pirate hunter's hand before falling over backwards. He could hear Malcolm muttering, Dead man. Both dead men. Tom got up, seeing Hornigold reaching for his sword, and kicked viciously under the man's chin, and then kicked him again to the side of his face so that Hornigold fell over. Tom stood up as Hornigold spat blood. He threw his cutlass away and grabbed the man's collar, headbutting him hard in the nose. Hornigold shrieked, digging his nails into Tom's arms. Ye bastard, he barked. I'll make ye pay, I swear it. Nothing'll rub out the mark of your treachery, Ben, said Tom, knocking Hornigold against the trunk of a tree and pinning him there. I'm only paying ye your due. The king's pardon would have made ye a free man, Tinker. Aye, but what is a free man if he's e'er a slave? All of a sudden, arms wrapped around Tom's throat, and he was pulled away. Malcolm, no! Stop! No tales, said Malcolm, dragging Tom away. Dead men? No tales. Hornigold bawled in laughter. That was something I wasn't expecting, he said, picking up his sword. Tom, struggling against Malcolm's grip, took a pistol out of his holster and fired at Hornigold's hand. The man jumped, howling, and dropped his weapon. Using the momentary distraction, Tom pulled Malcolm's arms away, tearing himself free. Malcolm tried to come at him again, but Tom pushed him away into a bush. A heavy weight smashed on top of Tom's head, and he crumpled. "Fucking pirate!" Hornigold spat, standing over him. "I'd sworn to rid the sea of your kind." "Our kind, Ben," Tom growled, trying to get up. Hornigold stomped on his face and... "No," Hornigold said. "No, tinker. I was nae your kind. You didn't see what became of Nassau, our pirate republic. A place of life, beauty and trade became a place of idling, idiocy and rot. It became a fucking pile of shite. We took our chance. Within 2 years, we chewed it up and spat it out. You're young, tinker. Naive. You didn't see what happened. You just wanted to belong. To fight for this freedom. To fulfill a dream that could ne'er be. I should know. I wanted the same thing." Tom breathed hard. "So turning in with the people who betrayed ye, betrayed us all, was your solution?" "Aye," said Hornigold, taking a dagger from his belt. "Because the people who betrayed us made a deal that none of us should have refused. But Thatch and Rackham were so eager to oppose. And Vane, well, he was done in by his own crew. They were heroes. They were pillocks, damn you." Hornigold spat, kneeling down. "Every last one of you were a bloody bunch of pillocks. From robbing the sea to being free of all charges. But penniless, Ben. You can't have everything, lad. You made your choice. Here's the consequence to your actions." Hornigold lowered the blade towards Tom's throat. "You'll be meeting your heroes soon enough." Tom shut his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Then Hornigold growled in frustration. Tom looked up, seeing Hornigold struggle against arms around his throat, Malcolm tightening his hold with every passing moment, bending the pirate hunter back. Tom stood up, picking up Hornigold's sword and rushing to him. Hornigold twisted his dagger and stabbed Malcolm several times in his stomach. "No!" Malcolm fell away, and Tom ran Hornigold through with his cutlass. The pirate hunter gasped, staring at Tom, then at the sword in his gut dribbling blood, then back at Tom. Tom twisted the blade and let Hornigold drop away. The sword clattered on the ground as Tom threw it and knelt beside Malcolm. He was heaving slowly. There were no words of comfort. Malcolm was a dead man. Tom could see it. He took the man's hand and held it. Tom listened as Malcolm muttered to himself, his lips becoming moist with his own gore. His wide eyes calmed, and the frantic muttering slowed to a low, soft murmur. Dead man. Dead men tell no tales," went on in Kingston. Tom sat, sombre and quiet, at a table on the veranda of an inn, sipping from a flagon of beer and brooding. The dancers were twirling, wearing sheer costumes of a tasteful red, and an Irishman was singing a ballad attuned to the strumming of his guitar. The last time Tom was here, Malcolm had been with him. An excellent captain, a fine sailor, and a good man. That was what Malcolm had said about him. So much had happened since then. Looking around with a deadened gaze and a heart like lead, Tom wondered how much of that description still fit him. It would, however, still fit Malcolm. Given the chance, Malcolm would have made a fine captain. He had been a fine sailor. He had been a good man. Had been. But now... Tom shut his eyes and turned his face to the ceiling. Tears weren't tears if they didn't drip down your face. Malcolm, just a grain in the sands of time. An iota in the pages of history. An unknown in the list of great men. A hand tugged his cloak, and Tom turned. "Maggie," he whispered, as Margaret climbed onto a seat next to his. She was wearing a bright blue dress, and had her fair hair tied back in a dark ribbon. She still looked a little older than she should, but she was, by all means, cute. She looked fresh and well rested, her illness having blown over quickly. "Mama's asleep," Tom and his family had left the unknown island in one of the longboats they found attached to the Benjamin. With the help of Hornigold's compass and map, they rowed out to sea, stopping for a while in the Bahamas, but then moving away quickly. Tom had lent some of his wealth to a lot of people around the Caribbean, in the guise of being helpful, but mostly for safekeeping in case of an emergency. And he'd come around to collect all his money with interest. What he had wasn't enough to buy an estate back in London and become a gentleman, but it was enough to live on beer and cider until he died of a heart attack. That's all I can look forward to. Are you still sad? Margaret asked her brother. He had dark lines under his eyes, and for the past few weeks, his face was always set in a frown. When she'd first met him, her brother had a spark in his eye. It was a spark of everything he was, youthful, charismatic, determined. That spark, Margaret noticed, was gone. Tom nodded at her question and then looked away. It's all right, Tom, she said, putting her arms on the table and resting her head against them. We'll see Malcolm again. He gave her a look, a questioning look distorted by the determination not to cry. In heaven, said Margaret. We'll see him there, won't we? In hell, Tom thought, shaking, his eyes blurring with tears. I'll see him in hell with the rest of us thieves and marauders. Poor bastard didn't even get buried. But he nodded and rubbed his eyes. Margaret turned away, not wanting to watch her older brother cry. He sniffed and said, I'm fine. Just fine. He took another gulp of his drink. You should go to bed, Maggie. Tom? Aye. Margaret wondered for a moment if it was the right time to ask questions, and then said, Everyone always called you Tinker. Papa didn't like that word. She paused. What does it mean? And why do you use it? Grateful for the change of subject, Tom said, Papa's mammy was a gypsy, Maggie. People don't like gypsies because they're queer, but probably more so because they're Irish. Gypsies are called tinkers sometimes. Papa didn't like it because he wanted to be liked, but nobody liked him. Everybody was scared that he'd curse him, and a tinker's curse always shows true. For the first time in weeks, Tom smiled. I used it because I like to scare people. Oh, said Margaret, as if everything made sense. Tom laughed a little at her reaction, but then he sniffed and the moment was gone. Margaret started. I'm sorry about your friend, Tom. I'm sorry about your father, Maggie. Margaret paused, thinking of a way to respond, but decided against it and asked, Can I have some of your drink? No, said Tom. Margaret screwed up her face. Why not? Tom scoffed. Your mammy'd kill me. But Mama couldn't kill a fly. But she'd kill me, Tom said. All she'd have to do is look at me. Margaret pouted, but didn't press. Instead, she asked, What now, Tom? Are we going to go back to London? London? Why? Because we live there. He looked around. Ain't it nicer here? I guess. I'll buy a house here, or maybe in New Providence. We could have a cow or a horse. Could even get a dog. I could work a farm, and you and your mammy could sew clothes, and we'd get a ship and sail out sometimes. And steal things, Margaret blurted out. Tom glared at her, giving a cautious look around. He had no intention of hanging dead in a gibbet after all of his troubles, but he shrugged and whispered with a wink, Maybe. He took another sip of his drink. But this'd be our new home. How does it sound? It sounds fantastic, cried Margaret. Does it now? Tom laughed. What should we call our new ship then? Margaret pondered. The Pillock. Tom doubled over in a fit of laughter. What? Pillock. Mama calls you that all the time. We're not gonna call my ship the Pillock. Margaret sighed, frustrated that she didn't understand what Tom was laughing about. What then? I think the Margaret would be nice. I like Maggie better. Ships don't have pet names, Maggie. Everything all right over here? Called one of the barmaids. Tom looked up. Anne? He said, surprised. Bonnie gazed at Tom for a moment, recognition lighting in her eyes. "Thomas?" She dropped her tray of drinks and launched herself at him. "They told me ye were dead!" Tom fell off his seat and landed in a heap on the floor, tangled in Bonnie's arms. "Good grief." "Shut up, you," she said, blushing. "What happened? I told you to stay, didn't I? Where did you go?" "Oh, Anne," Tom sighed, taking a brief look back at his confused sister. "It's a long story." This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either themselves products of the author's imagination, or if such names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents actually exist, the actions, views, and/or other characteristics attributed to them are products of the author's imagination. Nothing in this work of fiction should be regarded as inferring that in reality any actual person or entity has acted or would act in a given way, or that they hold or have held given views or characteristics. This work of fiction is not endorsed by the names, persons, brands, or businesses featured or referred to in it.